On the morning of September 11, 1983, a car with diplomatic plates stopped on a deserted stretch of suburban highway near Leningrad. A young woman came out with a baby blanket in her hands and tried to shake it off. She did it so awkwardly that she dropped the package, and when she picked it up, she took along with it a dirty, oiled package. A young American woman, Denisa von Augustenborg, was sure that no one could see her. There was not a soul around, and the husband, who was driving, was closely monitoring the situation. But suddenly, KGB operatives jumped out of the ground. Out of surprise, Denisa did not have time to throw away the spy container, the dirty package. The confused young woman hardly realized at that moment that she was at the epicenter of one of the largest espionage stories of the Cold War. This story reflects many features of that era: the constant confrontation between the two best intelligence agencies in the world, the KGB and the CIA. The desire of the U.S. military-industrial complex to seize the secrets of the Soviet nuclear fleet, and betrayal for selfish reasons. Leningrad, the cultural capital and the main tourist mecca of the USSR, in 1981 also became a new place of strength for the entire domestic underground, thanks to the Leningrad Rock Club on Rubinstein Street. In addition, Leningrad was the main sea gate in foreign countries. Tourist liners and dry cargo ships entered its ports daily, and scientific research vessels went on expeditions. The scientific research vessel Professor Zubov returned to Leningrad from Antarctica in September of 1981. A tall, thin, 45-year-old man appeared in the Leningrad port. It was Yuri Pavlov, the head of the radio engineering laboratory, who had arrived here as part of another scientific expedition across the Atlantic Ocean. Yuri Vasilievich Pavlov, born in 1935, graduated from the Faculty of Physics and Mechanics of the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute with a degree in experimental nuclear physics. He worked in closed institutes of the military-industrial complex. Until September 1981, he held the post of Chief Engineer Inspector of the Atomic Inspection of the Main Directorate of the USSR Navy, the so-called Maritime Register. He had access to documentation on the safety of ship operation and had information, including on our ships equipped with nuclear installations. Since graduating from university, Pavlov has changed several jobs, looking not for an interesting job, but for one where they pay more. He started writing his PhD thesis, but dropped out because he was bored. Pavlov dreamed of a beautiful life, fame, and dachas, and not just anywhere, but on the Bahamas. As he simply explained later at the investigation, I realized that the scope of the Maritime Register was narrow for me, and there was a long period of stagnation. I was not satisfied financially, first of all. In 1981, Pavlov joined the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute of the State Committee for Hydrometeorology, only to embark on an overseas voyage on a research vessel in the fall. No one on the ship even guessed what a dangerous adventure their colleague had embarked on. The security officer accompanying the Soviet delegation did not feel this either. Yuri Pavlov took the first step on the path to betrayal himself. He really wanted his talent as a nuclear physicist to be appreciated in the West. Therefore, before traveling abroad, he prepared a letter in English. In it, he wrote that he was not recognized in his homeland, and they did not give money to research his proposed method of producing artificial diamonds using a nuclear explosion. When, in October 1981, he and the ship's crew went ashore at the Norwegian port of Ålesund, the letter was in his pocket. In the letter, Pavlov thoughtfully described how he would look at the following meetings: a black coat, a knitted hat, and a colorful booklet in his right hand. He also partially outlined his biography, education, and previous jobs. While walking around the city, he dropped the letter into the mailbox, addressing it to the Consulate General of Germany. Twice later, in Hamburg and Reykjavik, Pavlov went ashore in a knitted hat, a dark coat, and with a booklet, but no one approached him. Soon the expedition ended, and Pavlov returned to Leningrad. He was at a loss to figure out why no one had contacted him. In the confrontation between the special services, intelligence is always one step ahead of counterintelligence. When the British MI6, the German BND, or the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States launched another covert operation against the Soviet Union, the first step was often to recruit an agent, a Soviet citizen who had access to defense secrets. It was only some time later that the KGB counterintelligence found out about it and made a retaliatory move. Spies in tuxedos is what the KGB called Western agents who used diplomatic cover. Soviet counterintelligence sought to make any activity on their territory as difficult as possible for them. Diplomats suspected by the KGB for espionage activities were almost always monitored outside their embassies, and the counterintelligence service carefully screened literally everyone who had recently arrived in the USSR. In Leningrad, the CIA intelligence group settled under the roof of the U.S. Consulate General. In 1981, the new vice consul, Lon von Augustenborg, led the reconnaissance group. Lon was born into the family of a famous U.S. diplomat. Before joining the CIA, he was a Los Angeles police officer. By diplomatic standards, he was too young to be a U.S. vice consul. Such a high cover status for Augustenborg was demanded from the U.S. Foreign Ministry at the CIA headquarters, which suggests that there were certain plans for him and he was apparently a promising employee. Counterintelligence was monitoring such potentially dangerous people literally 24 hours a day.
Denisa, Lon's wife, understood this perfectly and, as best she could, created a homely atmosphere and comfort so that nothing would distract Lon from his important and dangerous work. Shirts and ties had to be immaculate, and the 1.5-year-old daughter was well-groomed and put to bed. All this suited Denisa and corresponded to her ideas of a happy family. It was a little embarrassing that her husband too often assigned her to carry out delicate tasks in the city and did not mind at all that she took her daughter with her for additional disguise. But the young woman pushed the disturbing thoughts away from herself. On March 23, 1982, the scientific research vessel Professor Wyss, with Pavlov on board, entered the port of Hamburg during another expedition. Pavlov and his group went to an expensive department store. He was wearing a coat and a cap, but without a booklet. An elderly, tanned man approached him, who was clearly trying his best. He showed him the envelope with his letter, sent to the embassy, and asked. The German handed him an envelope and promised to meet him at one of the ports further along the route. This sweet elderly man was actually a career employee of the West German BND intelligence service. Since its creation, this special service has worked closely with the CIA. Most likely, West German intelligence very quickly established who Pavlov was, his education, and the position he held, and therefore sought to make the most of the information he probably possesses. Pavlov hesitated to open the envelope he had received from the elderly German. He was scared. What if someone saw their meeting and has already informed the right person? Maybe it's better to throw away the ill-fated envelope without looking at it before it's too late. But curiosity was stronger than fear. He barely waited until the hour when no one could come to his cabin and opened it. There was a wad of money, 800 West German marks, a considerable sum for a Soviet person. But what to do with them? Where should I hide them? Or maybe it's better to spend it. He remembered that in a jewelry store in the city he liked a massive gold bracelet for 550 marks and decided to buy it. It was this bracelet that later appeared in the investigation of the Pavlov case as one of the material evidence. West German intelligence took up Pavlov quite thoroughly. BND agents were waiting for him in almost every port where the Soviet research vessel entered. Rio de Janeiro, the Canary Islands, Copenhagen. With each new meeting, they gave him money. The German money that was allocated to support scientific research had to be worked off. But the Germans were not interested in artificial diamonds at all, but in the specific parameters of the nuclear power plants of Soviet submarines and warships, which Pavlov was directly involved in creating in his previous job. The characteristics of ships and specific projects are something that is of considerable interest to the military intelligence of foreign countries. Pavlov couldn't help but realize what he was being dragged into, but he didn't even try to refuse. The Germans made it clear that the money had to be earned. In the detailed questionnaires that he now received from the BND, along with the new amount, were questions about the defense enterprises where the Soviet Navy was being created. Pavlov was well versed in this subject and described the information in detail from memory. It had to be written quickly. The next day, even before the expedition ship left the port, he handed over what he had written to the German curators. Pavlov has new owners in the Uruguayan capital Montevideo. West German intelligence handed over its valuable agent to its American counterparts from the Central Intelligence Agency. German intelligence had its own area of responsibility and was focused primarily on its neighbors. The Soviet Union was in general beyond their strength because they needed serious positions and opportunities that the CIA had. The changing of the pieces in this spy game was not accidental. The United States was not satisfied that by the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had managed to catch up with America in terms of the number of modern nuclear submarines and even surpass it. The figures of the Pentagon generals loomed behind Pavlov's new CIA handlers. Any information about our military nuclear fleet was worth its weight in gold to them. Pavlov was frightened and annoyed by this cruel castling. He did not expect it and felt like a bargaining chip in someone else's game. Working for the Americans, the main opponents of the Soviet Union, seemed to him a much more dangerous task than cooperating with the Germans. In the evening, locked in his cabin, he could hardly force himself to read the letter addressed to him by his new owners. However, the very first lines calmed him down somewhat. "Dear friend, your safety and well-being are our top priority." Then there were instructions on how to meet at the following ports, and finally the payment system for espionage services was described in detail. $2,000 a month to a bank account, $10,000 a bonus at the end of the year, and $10,000 each for completing particularly important tasks. Pavlov liked the price list. He was very encouraged by the financial prospects of cooperation with the Americans. In May 1983, in Copenhagen, at the Monument to the Little Mermaid, he met with new curators. The American took the envelope with the answers from Pavlov and put a notebook and a note in his pocket. The note explained to him that the notebook had a hiding place behind the cardboard in the back. Pavlov, who had been finally recruited, received an additional amount of money and schemes for hiding operations using signal tags to communicate with the Americans in the USSR. During the preparation of the operation to capture the American intelligence officer, Major Yuri Shapirin practically spent the night at work. Here near the Silver Great Pond in Izmailovo, a favorite vacation spot for Muscovites, on the evening of July 20th, 1983, a car with diplomatic plates stopped. A young, fit man with a sports bag in his hands got out of it. It was Alex Grishchik, assistant to the U.S. military attaché. Despite the rain, he resolutely headed for the thicket of bushes and for a while fell out of the field of view of the KGB surveillance. Soon, the Americans soaked through, jumped out of the bushes, threw the bag into the trunk, and drove away. However, the KGB operatives noticed that his bag was noticeably lighter.
The search for the hidden Grishchik dragged on until midnight. As a result, a spy container disguised as a stone was discovered with a standard spy arsenal, cipher notebooks, instructions, and secret writing tools. There were clarifying questions in the questionnaires. For example, as you told us, the operating mode of the Kirov nuclear power plant at such and such speeds is such and such. Please confirm if this is the case. All such activities of the CIA staff who worked in Moscow under the guise of diplomatic posts were under the vigilant control of the famous American department of the Second Main Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. It was headed by Major General Ram Krasilnikov, a legendary spy hunter. The very name Ram Krasilnikov meant a lot to the Moscow station, to the CIA, and to the Russian department. If the scouts fell into the hands of his staff, then that's it. Shit. It was his team that had to identify the figures on the other side, which of the employees of the U.S. Embassy and consulates was a pure diplomat and who was an intelligence officer under the guise of a diplomatic position. The CIA did their best to remain in the shadows, but surveillance data, information from foreign intelligence, as well as a number of secret techniques allowed professionals to eventually figure them out. Alex Grishchik was no exception.
After the discovery of the spy stone, the KGB officers had to act very quickly. It was necessary to get acquainted with its contents, photograph it, and after that it was necessary to return it to the same place where it was discovered, which was done. Surveillance was established behind the bushes with a cunning stone returned. As the counterintelligence officers had expected, the next day an unknown man appeared in the area of the cache, who, just like the American diplomat the day before, dived into these bushes. Then he appeared, clearly taking the container intended for him. They did not detain this man, but they followed his further path. It soon became clear that the head of one of the divisions of the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute, Yuri Pavlov from Leningrad, came to the Metropolitan Park for the hiding place. He was immediately monitored around the clock. Conditional places of hiding places, instructions. All these are the usual, well-developed tools of American intelligence in this kind of games. They are designed to protect intelligence officers and their agents from failure. Therefore, the Americans acted cautiously in Leningrad, but quite calmly and confidently. Of course, they had no idea that all their actions were being monitored by KGB officers. In Leningrad, in accordance with the instructions received, Pavlov put a marker in the arch of the entrance courtyard on Kronverkskaya Street. She could be seen from passing cars. The label meant, "Pavlov took the hiding place in Moscow and is waiting for a signal indicating where to leave his answers to the Americans' questions." A personal "to" signal was set for him. How do I apply the label? The chalk is easily washed off by rain. The pencil inscription will not be seen from the car. That leaves the lipstick. In the Soviet Union, the range of lipsticks was not very large, but she had remarkable resilience. The red lipstick popular among brunettes contained the pigment carmine, as a result of which a trace of it remained on the lips for several days. It was with this lipstick that Pavlov applied the mark. On the 24th of July, 1983, at the appointed time at the point specified in the instructions, on the square near the Vladimir Cathedral, the wife of the U.S. Vice Consul, Denisa von Augustenborg, drove up. She parked the car with the trunk to the sidewalk and calmly went to the market to buy groceries. This meant that the next step in the spy game would be taken in Moscow. From that moment on, she received close attention. In the hierarchy of the CIA, David von Augustenborg held a fairly high post as chief of the Leningrad station, but he aimed much higher. Working successfully with a new high-value agent was supposed to be his career springboard. And Denisa, as a loving wife, was ready to help him in everything, so she did not hesitate to carry out any of his assignments. She went to the city on the right days and set and removed the warning signs. Like many wives of American intelligence officers, she did not receive any special training in England. She was an unprofessional intelligence officer. She probably understood that she was taking risks, but she did it for the sake of family well-being. In addition to the intelligence officers themselves, the CIA carried out some work with their spouses in terms of preparation for the mission assigned to the intelligence officer stationed in the Soviet Union. This is not an isolated example of wives participating in these operations. For example, if we recall the detention in Filevsky Park when the deputy CIA resident in Moscow was with his wife and 2 children. Denisa was taught the methods of counter-surveillance and evasion by her husband. When shopping, she could easily take a mirror out of her purse to fix her makeup and at the same time see if there was a KGB exterior behind her. If something bothered her, she easily changed her route, went into the first store she saw, began to look at the windows, smiling sweetly and not showing the slightest excitement. And after making sure that there was no surveillance, she calmly continued on her way. She turned out to be a good student and confidently performed her role. The young American woman loved bright lipstick, and she could hardly be blamed for it, but she stopped to put on lipstick exactly where it was necessary to put a warning mark. At the end of August of the 83rd year, Pavlov put a 2 in the entrance courtyard of house number 11 on Pestel Street. This meant that the container with the next task was in Moscow. Now Pavlov had to transfer his information through a cache at the designated location 40. So in the instructions of the CIA, a point on the Primorsky Highway in the suburbs of Leningrad, at the base of the 40 kilometers road sign, was designated. The marking tool, A tin can covered with a cloth stained with a liquid such as fuel oil. We must pay tribute to the Americans. They chose the place for the bookmark very competently. At the 40th kilometer, the terrain on both sides of the road was completely open, clearly visible from the car. Besides, the staff of the Consulate General passed here several times a day. 60 kilometers from Leningrad, near Zelenogorsk, the U.S. consulate rented a cottage. It was absolutely impossible to covertly place the capture group near the bookmark. Before the operation had even begun, it was on the verge of collapse.
It was necessary to come up with some kind of non-standard solution. The Americans were very professional in this situation. The Leningrad counterintelligence officers did not have the opportunity to organize covert surveillance from some closed posts. A Moscow task force led by Ram Krasilnikov immediately went to help the Leningrad counterintelligence officers. The fact that an operation was being prepared to capture an American intelligence officer was also known at the very top. Permission for its holding was given personally by Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB of the USSR, who already held the post of General Secretary of the CPSU at that time. At the very first operational meeting, costumed versions of the presence of the capture group at the site of the operation were immediately excluded. An unprecedented decision was made in its complexity, to build 2 bunkers next to the spy site. We dug at night in difficult conditions and took out more than 800 bags of soil. Not a single grain of sand was left on the highway. One bunker was dug out for the operatives from the capture group, who on command had to literally jump out of the ground next to the hiding place. Another one is for the technician who manages the video recording equipment. The American intelligence officers had to not only be caught red-handed but also record all their actions on videotape. And it was also necessary to put communication lines into the bunkers. The broadcast is monitored, so the wired connection is the most reliable. A telephone cable was stretched between the operation headquarters and the bunkers. At the same time, in order not to damage the asphalt surface, the cable was dragged under the roadway through drainage pipes with the help of a dog. One of the surveillance officers literally had a spaniel like this. A cable was tied around his neck, and when called, he crawled back and forth into these pipes several times. The operatives had to act in an environment as close to combat as possible. But it was at the 40th kilometer of the Primorsky Highway that the front line of the invisible war, which was constantly waged during these years by 2 of the best special services in the world, the KGB and the CIA, passed. And understanding this gave the KGB team strength. However, the Americans did not like to lose either. They had the opportunity to notice the preparation. If anything had alerted them, they would have immediately canceled the seizure of the cache. On the evening of September 10th, 1983, Yuri Pavlov put another 2 in the conditional place Dobro on Dobrolyubov Avenue. This meant that he had already laid the container at the 40 kilometers location. The next morning, a car with the license plates of the American Consulate General drove by. The tag was noticed, and the car moved in the direction of Primorsky Highway. At the 40th kilometer, the Americans slowed down, but then rushed on to the Consulate General's dacha. Soon, Lon von Augustenborg left there with his wife and young daughter. All this time, the capture group was in position. They ended up sitting there for 17 hours. The KGB assumed that Augustenborg himself would go on a risky operation. Denisa's appearance with a baby blanket in her hands was completely unexpected. In a matter of seconds, she was surrounded by KGB members. An employee of the capture group said that she was so taken aback that she sat down on the ground and did not know what to do. Leaving his wife, the vice consul tried to escape and stepped on the gas. My engine was running at the same time when the signal went off about the removal of the cache. It was blocked by a passing car, and Lon von Augustenborg himself was immobilized by the tough guys from the capture group. The whole operation to detain them went so fast that their daughter did not have time to be scared and fell asleep in her mother's arms while they were being taken to the reception of the Leningrad KGB Directorate. The American side did not even try to intercede. For illegal espionage activities, Lon David von Augustenborg and his wife Denisa von Augustenborg were declared persona non grata and expelled from the Soviet Union within 24 hours. In April 1985, Yuri Pavlov was sentenced to 15 years in prison by a military tribunal for treason. However, in October 1992, at the request of the American side,
Pavlov was released under an amnesty, and he left for the United States. Here too, in general, such an absolutely anecdotal case occurs because when he arrives in America and says, "Where is the bank where all the money owed to me, including during my time in prison?" American officials say, "What kind of money? Which bank? Did someone somewhere tell you about some kind of money? What does the American state have to do with it?" And the masterful operation of the Leningrad counterintelligence agents to capture the American resident has forever entered the history of the Russian special services as the most successful during the Cold War.